November 16, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, German-Belgian border. A German Feldwebel named Willy Müller, 31, 5 years in uniform, 2 of them on the Eastern Front, crouched in a waterlogged foxhole and watched the tree line through field glasses. What he saw made no sense. The Americans were crossing the WWII stream. Same shoulder patch, the Ivy Leaf of the 4th Infantry Division. Same regiment, the 22nd Infantry. He had fought these men in Normandy 5 months ago. His company had killed dozens of them in the bocage. He had watched their medics drag bodies through the hedgerows. He had counted their dead. And yet, here they were. Full-strength companies, clean weapons, new boots, faces he had never seen before, moving through the forest with the kind of energy that belongs to men who slept last night, who ate this morning, who believe they will eat again tomorrow. Müller had not slept in 36 hours. He had not eaten a hot meal in 9 days. His uniform had not been washed since August. Half his platoon was made up of men he had met less than a week ago. Luftwaffe clerks, 17-year-old conscripts, a 46-year-old postal worker from Dusseldorf. His regiment, the 275th Infantry Division, had been bled white in Normandy and refilled with whatever the Ersatz could scrape from the bottom of the barrel. He was exhausted. Bone-deep, 5-year exhausted. The kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep, because sleep stopped helping a long time ago. And across the stream, the Americans didn't look tired at all. This is one of the quieter mysteries of the Second World War. Not a battle, not a weapon, not a single brilliant decision by a general. It's something German veterans said again and again, in prisoner interrogations, in post-war memoirs, in conversations with historians decades later. They said the Americans always looked fresh. Always had ammunition. Always had food. Always had new men when the old ones fell. No matter how many you killed, more came. And they didn't look like men who had been fighting a war. They looked like men who had just arrived. If you want to understand what American soldiers and the system behind them actually accomplished, a like and a subscription help this story reach the people who care about that history. To understand why the Americans never seemed to tire, you first have to understand what tired actually looked like. Not the American version, the German version. Because by November 1944, exhaustion wasn't just a condition in the Wehrmacht. It was the defining feature of an entire army. The German soldier who dug that foxhole in the Hürtgen Forest had not started the war tired. In 1939, the Wehrmacht was the best-fed, best-equipped, best-trained military force on the planet. A standard German infantry division fielded 17,000 men, with organic artillery, anti-tank guns, engineers, signals, and a logistics tail that could sustain offensive operations for weeks. The Ersatzheer, the replacement army, operated like a mirror of the field army. Every frontline regiment had a twin back home, a replacement battalion in the same military district, staffed by the same regional population, training men who would slot into the same unit they were destined to join. It was elegant, it was efficient, and it worked. For exactly as long as Germany kept winning short wars. But Germany did not keep winning short wars. By the summer of 1944, the average German infantry division on the Western Front had been formally reduced from 17,000 men to 12,500. And most divisions didn't even have that. The 275th Division that Müller served in had been reconstituted after near destruction in Normandy with a patchwork of rear echelon troops, convalescents, and teenage conscripts who had received 8 weeks of training instead of the doctrinal 16. Hold that number, 8 weeks. Because what the Americans were doing with their training pipeline on the other side of the Atlantic is something no German general fully understood until the war was over. And when they did understand it, several of them used the same word. They called it unfair. To understand what the Germans meant, you have to see what was happening inside their own replacement system by the autumn of 1944. Colonel Karl Roessler commanded the 89th Infantry Division. It had been created in January of that year from conscripts pulled out of the Ersatzheer, the replacement army, and sent to Normandy. By September, one of its 2 remaining regiments had essentially ceased to exist. The other had 350 men. A full-strength regiment should have had over 3,000. Roessler did what every German commander on the Western Front was doing by then. He pulled his artillerymen out of their gun pits and gave them rifles. He took his engineers off mine-clearing duty and put them in foxholes. He gathered his cooks, his supply clerks, his signals operators, anyone who could hold a weapon, and marched them to the front line. The High Command sent him reinforcements, a battalion of reservists, 3 battalions of Luftwaffe ground protection troops who had never fired a shot in anger, and a battalion of 450 former Soviet prisoners of war who had been pressed into German service. This was the 89th Infantry Division. This was what a German division looked like in the 5th year of the war. Not defeated, not yet. Still fighting, still dangerous. But made of men who were never supposed to be infantry, led by officers who were running out of everything except orders to hold. And across the line, the American 4th Infantry Division, which had landed on Utah Beach on June 6th and fought through Normandy for 3 straight months, was attacking the Hurtgen Forest at something close to full strength. Its 22nd Infantry Regiment went into the forest with rifle companies averaging 162 men each. Within 7 days, those companies averaged 87. Losses were catastrophic. By the end of 18 days of fighting, the regiment's rifle companies had suffered casualties equal to 151% of their original strength. 151%. Think about what that number means. It means the regiment didn't just lose every rifleman it started with, it lost them, replaced them, and lost many of the replacements too. And yet the 22nd Infantry never fell below 75% of its authorized strength. Not once. In 18 days, 1,988 replacement soldiers were fed into the regiment while it was still in contact with the enemy. New men arrived at night, were assigned to a squad, and were in a foxhole by morning. The regiment bled and refilled. Bled and refilled. Like a heartbeat. From the German side of the forest, this looked like something out of a nightmare. You killed Americans on Monday. On Wednesday, the same unit was back at full strength. You destroyed a company, and a week later that company was attacking your position with new faces, new rifles, and fresh ammunition. The shoulder patch never changed. The unit designation never changed. But the men inside the unit were completely different people. The Germans had a word for this. They called the American army unerschöpflich, inexhaustible. But it wasn't inexhaustible. It was a system. And that system had a name that every American soldier who went through it remembered with bitterness for the rest of his life. They called them Repeldepots, replacement depots. The staging areas where individual soldiers, fresh from training camps in the United States or recovered from wounds in rear area hospitals, were collected, sorted, and shipped forward to whichever frontline unit needed bodies. Not as a formed unit, not with men they had trained with, not with officers they knew. One at a time. A name on a roster, a body to fill a slot. The system was, by nearly every account, dehumanizing. Soldiers described it as being treated like ammunition, boxed, shipped, and expended. One veteran said that when the war was over, he planned to attend the war crimes trial of the G1, the Army's personnel staff, because what they did to replacements was a crime against morale. And here is where this story takes its first turn. Because the German veterans who said the Americans never looked tired, they weren't paying a compliment. They were describing something that frightened them, something they couldn't match, couldn't counter, and couldn't understand. The Americans had built a machine that consumed its own soldiers and produced fresh ones. The men inside that machine often hated it. But from the outside, from a flooded foxhole in the Hurtgen Forest, through field glasses, wearing a uniform that hadn't been washed since the summer, it looked like the enemy had discovered a way to defeat exhaustion itself. The Repeldepots were only one part of that machine. There were others, and some of them operated so close to the front lines that German soldiers could smell them before they could see them. What they smelled was something no German unit on the Western Front had access to by the autumn of 1944. It was hot food. On the morning of November 2nd, 1944, somewhere behind the American lines near Aachen, a field kitchen belonging to the 4th Infantry Division's mess section set up in a bombed-out farmhouse. 2 cooks, both privates, both younger than 25, had been awake since 3 in the morning. They heated water in a 60-gallon M1937 field range, boiled coffee, scrambled powdered eggs with canned bacon, and loaded the food into insulated Mermite cans, double-walled containers designed to keep meals hot for up to 4 hours. By 0600, a Jeep carrying 2 Mermite cans, a box of bread, and a 5-gallon coffee thermos was picking its way along a cratered road toward a rifle company's position, less than 2 miles from the German line. This sounds ordinary. It was not. On the German side of that same stretch of forest, breakfast was a piece of Kommissbrot, hard, dark military bread, issued 3 days ago. Maybe a tin of artificial honey. If a man was lucky, cold ersatz coffee brewed from roasted grain. There was no field kitchen within 5 miles. There hadn't been one in weeks. The Luftwaffe owned the skies so completely that any vehicle moving behind German lines in daylight was a target. Supply trucks ran only at night, on roads pocked with bomb craters, burning fuel that the Wehrmacht could not replace. And fuel was the key. Remember that word, fuel, because it explains something about the war that a tank or a rifle never could. A hot meal seems like a small thing. It is not a small thing. Military psychiatrists who studied combat effectiveness during the Second World War found that 3 factors predicted whether a soldier could keep fighting: sleep, mail from home, and hot food. Of the 3, hot food was the most immediate. A man who has eaten a hot meal in the last 12 hours fights differently than a man who hasn't. Not because of the calories. Cold rations have calories. Because of what a hot meal means. It means somebody behind you is thinking about you. It means the system is working. It means you are not forgotten. By the autumn of 1944, the American Army in Europe was serving roughly 4 million hot meals a day. Not every soldier got one every day. Men on the front line often survived on K rations and C rations for days at a stretch. But the system existed. The infrastructure existed. And when a unit rotated even a mile behind the line, there was hot food waiting. The Germans had no equivalent. Not because German cooks were worse, not because German logisticians didn't understand nutrition, because the supply chain that made hot meals possible, the trucks, the fuel, the roads, the air cover to protect those roads, had been systematically destroyed. And here is where one road tells the story of an entire war. On August 25, 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy had created a problem that no pre-invasion plan had anticipated. Patton's Third Army was racing east so fast that it was outrunning its own supply lines. The French railway network had been obliterated, partly by Allied bombers before D-Day, partly by the retreating Germans. The port of Cherbourg was operational, but could not handle the volume, and the armies needed everything: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement parts, delivered not to a static front, but to a front that was moving 50 miles in a week. The solution was conceived in a 36-hour emergency meeting and launched the same day. They called it the Red Ball Express. Nearly 6,000 2.5-ton trucks running on a dedicated one-way loop of French highways, hauling 12,500 tons of supplies per day at the peak. The trucks ran around the clock. 2 roads, one outbound, one return, marked with bright red circles, closed to all other traffic. Military police at every intersection, engineers patrolling to repair bomb damage, wreckers standing by for breakdowns. 23,000 men operated the Red Ball Express. 70% of them were black soldiers, assigned to service and supply units because the segregated army believed they lacked the ability to fight. They drove 18 to 20 hours a day. They ate C rations wired to their exhaust manifolds to heat them. One driver remembered delivering jerry cans of gasoline directly to a stranded Sherman while German soldiers were close enough to shout at him. Between August and November, the Red Ball Express moved over 400,000 tons of supplies. It was the largest truck convoy operation in military history, and it was invisible to the men it served. An infantryman in the Hürtgen forest who opened a fresh case of ammunition didn't know it had been loaded by a 19-year-old private from Alabama onto a truck at a depot outside Cherbourg, driven 300 miles through the French countryside at night with blackout headlights, unloaded at a forward dump, picked up by a divisional supply truck, and delivered to his battalion by a jeep that made the last 2 miles under mortar fire. He just knew the ammunition was there. And on the German side, the ammunition was not there. The fuel was not there. The food was not there. Not because Germany had stopped producing them. German factories were still running, still outputting shells and tanks and ersatz coffee. But the distance between a German factory and a German foxhole had become a killing ground. Allied fighter bombers owned the roads by day. The rail network was shattered. Fuel was rationed so tightly that panzer divisions sometimes sat motionless for days, waiting for enough gasoline to move. This is the gap that German veterans were describing when they said the Americans never looked tired. Not the men themselves, the system behind the men. A system that could move 400,000 tons of supplies across a continent in 3 months and deliver a hot breakfast 2 miles from the enemy. But supplies were only half of it, because there was something else the American army delivered to its frontline soldiers that no German division had seen since 1942. Clean uniforms, hot water, soap. And the men who delivered them had one of the strangest job titles in military history. They were called Gruesome Gertie's Boys, or sometimes the Louse Chasers. Officially, they belonged to quartermaster fumigation and bath companies, units whose sole purpose was to give frontline soldiers a hot shower and a clean uniform. Corporal Benjamin Berry, a young man from Philadelphia, served in the 863rd Quartermaster Fumigation and Bath Company. His job was water. When the company set up, usually in a field behind the lines, sometimes in a shattered French village, occasionally in a requisitioned German farmhouse, Berry's task was to find a local water source, decontaminate it, pump it into a portable tank, truck it back to the company area, and feed it through a heating unit into the shower tents. Next to the showers, an army laundry outfit erected its own tents. Inside were piles of clean uniforms, shirts, trousers, underwear, socks, washed, sterilized, inspected, and sorted by size. The system worked like a swap. A soldier walked in wearing whatever he had been fighting in for the past 3 weeks. He stripped. He handed his filthy uniform to Berry's team. He walked into the shower tent, stood under hot water for the first time in weeks, and scrubbed himself with Army-issue soap. When he walked out the other side, a clean uniform was waiting for him. Not his uniform, a uniform. The right size, pressed, deloused. Berry remembered the moment the frontline soldiers first saw the setup. They came in looking haggard, caked in mud, some of them moving like old men. And then something changed. Their shoulders came up. Their faces shifted. Berry put it simply, they brightened up when they saw us. This was not a luxury. This was engineering. The American army had learned something in North Africa and Italy that the German army had known since the Eastern Front but could no longer act on. A soldier infested with lice, wearing wet socks, and covered in mud does not fight at full capacity. Trench foot alone, caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, had knocked over 70,000 American soldiers out of action during the winter of 1944 to 45. The number would have been far worse without the quartermaster bath and laundry units. The system was not perfect. It could not reach every man. A rifleman in continuous contact with the enemy might go weeks without a shower, weeks without a change of socks. But the system existed. When a battalion rotated off the line for even 48 hours, the fumigation and bath company was there. Hot water, clean clothes, and, if the man was lucky, a cot with a blanket in a warm tent. Now think about that from the other side of the line. A German Lanze in the Hürtgen forest in November 1944 had one uniform, the one he was wearing. If it was wet, and in that forest, in that season, it was always wet, it stayed wet. If it was torn, he patched it himself. If it was infested with lice, he lived with the lice. The Wehrmacht had once operated its own field delousing stations, but by late 44, the logistics to support them had collapsed, along with everything else. A German prisoner captured in the Hürtgen that November would have been escorted behind American lines and seen something that stopped him in his tracks. Not tanks, not artillery. The showers, the laundry tents, the stacks of clean uniforms, the field kitchens serving meals from Mermite cans, the aid stations stocked with plasma and morphine and sulfa powder, the trucks, hundreds of them, parked in orderly rows with full fuel tanks. This was the moment when many German soldiers understood something their generals had been saying for months. It was not that the Americans fought harder. It was not that they were braver or more skilled. It was that behind every American rifleman stood an invisible army. An army of truck drivers, cooks, laundry workers, mechanics, medics, and supply clerks, whose sole function was to keep that rifleman fed, clean, armed, and replaceable. The German word for it was Materialschlacht, a battle of materials. And Germany had lost this battle long before the first American soldier crossed the Rhine. But here's the part of the story that most people miss. The system that kept the Americans looking fresh, it was not gentle to its own soldiers. The Repeldeppels that fed replacement men into shattered units treated those men like interchangeable parts. The supply chain that delivered hot food and clean socks also delivered human beings, alone, knowing no one, dropped into a foxhole next to strangers, and expected to fight by morning. The German replacement system, for all its failures by 44, had been built around one idea. A soldier should fight alongside men from his own town, his own region. The American system was built around a different idea. A soldier is a component. He can be manufactured, shipped, and installed wherever the machine needs him. Both systems were brutal, but only one of them was sustainable. And in December of 1944, the German High Command decided to test that sustainability in the most dramatic way possible. They gathered everything they had left. Every tank, every gallon of hoarded fuel, every fresh division scraped from the Ersatzheer, and threw it at a thinly held sector of the American line in the Ardennes forest. For the first time since Normandy, German soldiers broke through. They overran American positions, they captured supply dumps, and what they found inside those dumps told them more about why they were losing the war than any briefing from Berlin ever had. December 17, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper led the spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army through the pre-dawn darkness. His Kampfgruppe, 4,800 men, roughly 100 tanks and armored vehicles, was the tip of Hitler's last gamble. The plan was simple in concept and suicidal in logistics. Punch through the thinly held American line, race west to the Meuse River, seize the bridges, split the Allied armies in two. Piper's fuel allocation for the entire operation was enough to get him halfway to his objective. The rest, he was told, he would have to capture from the Americans. At 0700, his lead tanks rolled into the town of Bühlingen and found an American fuel depot. Piper's men swarmed it. They filled every tank, every truck, every jerry can they could find. For 1 hour, the most feared armored column on the Western Front stopped fighting and started pumping gasoline. This is the image to hold in your mind. Not a battle. A gas station. The most elite armored unit Germany could still field, veterans of Kursk, of Kharkov, of years of fighting on the Eastern Front, reduced to scavenging fuel from the enemy because their own supply chain could no longer deliver it. And what Piper's men found at Bühlingen was only the beginning. As German forces pushed deeper into the bulge over the next 3 days, they overran American supply areas, aid stations, and command posts. And everywhere they went, they found the same thing: abundance. Crates of ammunition stacked 5 feet high. Cases of sea rations by the thousands. Medical supplies the Wehrmacht hadn't seen in 2 years. Morphine syrettes, plasma bottles, sulfa packets, blankets, waterproof ponchos, cigarettes, cartons of them, winter boots lined with felt. One account describes German soldiers stopping in the middle of an advance to eat captured American rations. Not because they were hungry in the way a man is hungry before dinner, because they were hungry in the way a man is hungry when he has been underfed for months and suddenly stumbles into a warehouse of food. Some of them ate so fast they made themselves sick. There is a photograph from the Ardennes that shows a knocked-out Tiger II, one of the most powerful tanks in the world, sitting next to a row of abandoned American jerry cans. The caption in the archive reads, "Items the Germans never had enough of. Not tanks, not guns, jerry cans." The war, by December 1944, was being decided by who had more gasoline, not who had thicker armor. Piper made it 70 miles in 3 days. Then he stopped. Not because the Americans defeated him in battle, though small American units fought with extraordinary courage at crossroads and bridges across the Ardennes, buying hours that turned into days. He stopped because he ran out of fuel. By December 24th, his Kampfgruppe was surrounded at the village of La Glaise, out of gasoline, nearly out of ammunition, down to a quarter of its original strength. His aid station had no anesthetics. His doctor could perform nothing more than amputations without painkillers. 1,000 miles to the west, in England, American supply officers were already loading ships. And this is where the story turns, because what happened next was not just a military victory. It was a demonstration of the system that German veterans would talk about for the rest of their lives. In the 72 hours after the German breakthrough, the American Army moved over 60,000 vehicles across the road network of Belgium and Luxembourg. The 101st Airborne Division traveled 100 miles by truck from Reims to Bastogne in less than 24 hours, arriving in the town just ahead of the German encirclement. Patton's Third Army, already engaged in heavy fighting to the south, pulled 3 full divisions off the line, turned them 90 degrees north, and attacked into the German flank within 48 hours. The logistics behind that movement are almost incomprehensible. Turning an army 90 degrees is not a matter of telling the tanks to go left. It means rerouting fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement parts, and communications for 150,000 men, simultaneously, in winter, on icy roads, under air attack, to new positions that didn't exist on any supply plan 48 hours earlier. The Germans could not do this. Not because their generals were less capable. Manteuffel and Rundstedt understood maneuver warfare as well as anyone alive. Because they did not have the trucks. They did not have the fuel. They did not have the tires, the spare parts, the road engineers, the traffic control MPs, the signal companies, or the 10,000 other invisible components that make a modern army move. 3/4 of German divisional transport in the Ardennes was horse-drawn. Horses that needed feed, the Wehrmacht couldn't supply, pulling wagons on roads the Luftwaffe couldn't protect, carrying ammunition that German factories could produce, but German trains could no longer deliver. By January, the bulge was closed. The Germans had lost over 100,000 men and 800 tanks they could not replace. The Americans had lost roughly 80,000 and replaced them. Within weeks, the divisions that had been mauled in the Ardennes were back at full strength. New tanks, new trucks, new men from the Reppeldepels, clean uniforms from the quartermaster laundry units, hot meals from the field kitchens. Received replacements within days and was back on the attack within a week. The 22nd Infantry Regiment in the Hürtgen Forest lost more men than it started with and never stopped fighting. Not because the men were superhuman, because the machine behind them never stopped feeding new men forward. And here is the irony that cuts to the heart of this story. The German system was built around the soldier. Each man was part of a specific unit, trained with the same men, led by officers who knew his name. When that unit was destroyed, the men who survived were sent home together, rebuilt together, and returned to the front together. It was humane. It preserved bonds. It respected the individual. The American system was built around the slot. A rifle company needed 162 men. If it had 120, 42 replacements were shipped in. They arrived knowing no one. They were assigned to squads by a sergeant they had never met. Many of them were killed before anyone learned their name. One replacement described the experience as being a spare part, stamped, shipped, and installed. The German system was human. The American system was industrial. And in a war of attrition, industrial won. By January 1945, Germany's 300 divisions averaged between 6,000 and 8,000 men each. Many existed only on paper. The Volksgrenadier divisions that had been scraped together from the Ersatzheer, teenage conscripts, men with stomach ailments grouped into special battalions, Luftwaffe ground crews who had never held a rifle, former Soviet prisoners who fought because the alternative was starvation. These were divisions in name only. Across the line, America's 90 divisions averaged over 14,000 men each. They had ammunition. They had fuel. They had winter clothing that actually fit. They had plasma for their wounded and trucks to carry them to hospitals. And when a man fell, another man arrived to take his place, usually within 72 hours. This is what Rundstedt meant. This is what he couldn't believe. Not that the Americans were braver or smarter, that they had built a system where losing men did not mean losing capability, where a division could bleed, could suffer casualties that would have destroyed a German division, and still be at full strength the following week. He called it impossible to withstand, and he was right. But there is one more piece of this story that turns everything you have heard so far on its head. Because the system that made the Americans look inexhaustible, the system that terrified German veterans into admitting they had never seen anything like it, that system had a cost. And the men who paid it were not generals or logisticians. They were the replacements themselves. A 19-year-old private arrives at a replacement depot outside Liège in January 1945. He has been in Europe for 11 days. He trained at Camp Blanding, Florida for 16 weeks. He has never heard a shot fired in anger. He does not know where he is going. He does not know what unit he will join. He waits for 3 days in a muddy field with 400 other men. They are not addressed by name. They are addressed by the last 4 digits of their serial number. They are inventory. On the 4th day, a truck arrives. 6 hours later, a sergeant at a crossroads points at him. "You're in Easy Company, 2nd Platoon, 3rd Squad. Follow me." He is in his foxhole before dark. The man sharing it, a corporal who has been in the line since October, does not wake up when German artillery starts falling. He has learned to tell by sound which shells are close enough to kill him. The private does not sleep. He will not sleep properly for the next 4 months. Studies found, from the German side, this looked like resurrection. And it raised a question that went deeper than logistics, deeper than fuel dumps and replacement depots. A question that Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the most senior German commander in the West, tried to answer when British historian Basil Littleheart sat down with him after the war. Rundstedt named 3 things that had defeated Germany. The first 2, air power and interference from Hitler, were expected. But the third one was not. And the way he described it suggested that even after the war was over, he still could not quite believe what he had seen. What Rundstedt described to Littleheart was not a weapon. It was not a tactic. It was not even a general. He described a country that could lose a battle on Monday and fight a completely new battle on Friday, with the same units, at the same strength, as if the first battle had never happened. He described supply lines that rebuilt themselves faster than the Luftwaffe could cut them. He described an army that seemed to grow stronger the longer the war lasted, while his own army grew weaker with every month. He used a phrase that Littleheart recorded carefully. Rundstedt said that wherever the Allies concentrated their forces, they would break through. That Germany was in no position to withstand a prolonged war, and that the root of the whole trouble was not any single battle or decision. It was that the Americans had built a military system designed for a long war, and Germany had not. This is the deepest layer of the answer. And it begins not on a battlefield, but in an office in Washington in 1941, with a decision made by one man that shaped everything that followed. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, faced a problem that no military planner in history had confronted at this scale. The United States needed to build an army from almost nothing, a peacetime force of under 200,000, to something capable of fighting simultaneously in Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, and a dozen other theaters, while also supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and China through Lend-Lease, while also running the world's largest naval construction program, while also building an atomic bomb. There were not enough men for all of it. There were not enough ships for all of it. Something had to give. What Marshall decided was radical, and it was the decision that German generals would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. He capped the United States Army at roughly 90 divisions. 90. Germany, over the course of the war, fielded over 300. The Soviet Union had over 500. Marshall chose 90 and refused to go higher. But, and this is the part that matters, he made those 90 divisions permanent. They would not be razed, destroyed, and replaced. They would be kept in the fight continuously, maintained at full strength through a river of individual replacements, and supported by a logistics system so deep that a division could take 50% casualties and be combat ready again within 2 weeks. The arithmetic was simple. Instead of spending manpower on forming new divisions, Marshall spent it on keeping existing divisions alive. Instead of training entire units and shipping them whole, the way Germany did, he trained individual soldiers in the United States, shipped them across the Atlantic, funneled them through replacement depots, and inserted them into whatever division needed them most. The result was an army that looked, from the outside, like it could not be killed. A German division that lost 40% of its strength in Normandy went back to Germany, if it was lucky, to rebuild for months. An American division that lost 40% of its strength in Normandy, that replacement soldiers were killed or wounded at rates far higher than veterans in the same unit. The cruelest statistic? In some infantry units, the majority of replacements became casualties before anyone in their squad learned their full name. Military psychiatrist John Appel found that the average American infantryman was worn out after 200 to 240 days of combat. In the Normandy hedgerows, 98% of soldiers who survived 60 continuous days of fighting became psychiatric casualties. The British Army rotated men, 12 days in the line, 4 days of rest, and a rifleman could function for 400 days. The American Army had no such policy. Soldiers stayed in the line for 40, 60, sometimes 80 days without relief. And the men who broke were replaced by men who knew nothing. And those men broke faster. This is the machine that the Germans saw from the other side. What they were seeing was not endurance. It was turnover. The faces that looked fresh were fresh because they had arrived 48 hours ago. The men they had killed last week were gone, and new men stood in their places. And from a German foxhole, it looked exactly like an army that could not be exhausted. But it could be exhausted, one man at a time. The difference was that America could afford it. Not because American lives were cheaper, because American factories, farms, training camps, and shipping lanes produced a surplus of everything, including men, that no other nation on earth could match. A German officer captured in the Ardennes told his interrogator that he knew the war was lost when he saw American artillerymen abandoning piles of 155mm shells by the side of the road. Not because they were fleeing in panic, but because the shells were not important enough to slow down for. His own gunners had been rationing every round for months. That was the moment, he said. That was when he understood. The 22nd Infantry Regiment came out of the Hurtgen Forest on December 3, 1944. Of the men who had walked in 18 days earlier, most were gone. The regiment had received nearly 2,000 replacements during those 18 days. Many of those replacements were also gone. The unit that marched out bore the same name, wore the same patch, carried the same colors, but it was not the same unit. It was a ship of Theseus, built from young men instead of planks. Within 2 weeks, the 22nd Infantry was back at fighting strength. The machine did not ask what men knew. It asked what the table of organization required. On the other side, the 275th Infantry Division was effectively destroyed. By the spring of 45, it existed only in records. Willy Müller, the Feldwebel who had watched the Americans cross the Rote Weh through his field glasses, was captured near the Rhine in March of 45. He weighed 138 pounds, down from 176. His boots were held together with wire. When the Americans processed him, they gave him a blanket, a sea ration, and a cup of coffee. It was the first real coffee he had tasted in 2 years. Decades later, he said one thing that his grandson remembered. He said the Americans always looked like they had just arrived. No matter how many men fell, the next morning there were new men, and they looked clean and fed and rested. He said it was the most demoralizing thing he experienced in the entire war. The feeling that you were fighting an enemy that could not be worn down. He was right about what he saw. He was wrong about what it meant. The Americans were not unwearable. The individual American soldier was just as breakable as the individual German soldier. 200 days. That was the limit. But the system that surrounded that soldier, the factories, the farms, the training camps, the ships, the trucks, the replacement depots, the quartermaster bath companies, the Red Ball Express, that system could not be worn down, not by the Wehrmacht, not by anyone on earth in 1944. The Germans didn't lose to soldiers. They lost to a civilization that had learned how to turn its entire strength into a machine and keep that machine running long after the enemies had ground to a halt. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If it gave you something, a detail you didn't know, an angle you hadn't considered, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history deserves to be seen, and it helps these stories find the viewers who care about them most. If you're not subscribed yet, I'd be grateful if you hit subscribe and the bell. There are more stories like this one coming. I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if someone in your family served in the Second World War, your father, your grandfather, your great-uncle, tell me about them in the comments. These stories belong to the men who served, and to the families who waited for them to come home. If your father, your grandfather, or your great-uncle wore an American uniform in the Second World War, I'd be honored to hear about them.